all of you are able to hear me, and we'll wait a bit for some other participants, but this is our third discussion forum on the COVID-19 and its impact on human rights in Africa. And for today, we'll focus on the economic and trade-related impact of this pandemic. I think we'll still wait for a couple of minutes before starting. And today we have 3 speakers. One of them are former TILA students. Aisha took the class in 2010. We also have Kate, who was here in 2014, and Chenesai in 2013. And she will try to address various topics related to this pandemic. I think at the moment we have 39 participants, so I propose that we wait for maybe 5 minutes at more, and we'll start after. I think probably we can start now. So, as I said, this is the third panel discussion on the impact of COVID-19 on human rights in Africa, and we have with us today Aisha, who is a senior associate at Bowans, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and she will speak about the impact of COVID-19 on the right and obligation of employers. We'll have also two other speakers, Kate and Chenesai. Yeah, I think Chenesai just joined us. So maybe I will give the floor to Aisha first. She will speak for about 10 minutes, and then after we'll also listen to Chenesai. Hello, Chenesai. Hello.
Yes, can I start?
Yes, I think just please 1 second. I just want to make sure that.
Hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Something and there you go. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fantastic. I'm so sorry. I'm having connectivity issues out here.
Okay, no problem. So, yes, as I was saying, yes, today we'll have Aisha, you and Kate speaking about the economic and trade-related impact of the COVID-19 on human rights in Africa. So probably I will give the floor to Aisha first. And then after, we'll also share your view on this topic and we'll engage the discussion. But maybe in the meantime, I can also remind the audience that they can ask the question on the chat box. And then after, they will be allowed to start asking and discussing some of the issue our speaker will raise. So, Chenesai, you are founder and CEO of Chenesai Africa, and you're also consultant. Am I right?
You're absolutely right.
Okay, and you were also a student of the TILA program in 2013.
Right, that's correct.
Okay, great. So now I will give the floor to Aisha, and then after Chenesai, you will also be allowed to speak. Aisha,
fantastic.
the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Aisha.
Yes, hi. My topic today is on the impact of COVID-19 on employers' rights and obligation. Well, we all understand that COVID-19 has various effects on the existing employment contracts, and my discussion will explore employers' rights and obligation and ensuring business continuity and managing prolonged absence from the workplace with a focus on Tanzania.
Okay.
Well, in these extreme challenging times, we are concerned of people and on how employers react to the situation. This is an unprecedented situation, and it is not a desire for the employee or the employer. As such, I'll discuss the legal framework for the employer to decide on trade-off that needs to be negotiated in relation to COVID-19. And before I look at the legal framework, I think it's very important first to look at the situation on the ground now in Tanzania. The first confirmed case of COVID was confirmed in March, and much later than our neighbors in the region, like Kenya and Uganda. And immediately the government announced the closure of schools and suspension of sports activities, but stopped well short of introducing the stringent containment measures adopted by our neighbors across the region. And some media described our response as a wait and see approach aimed at avoiding to bring business and trade to a standstill. And the argument was that majority of the Tanzanians live to mouth to hand economy. And if you introduce stringent measures like a lockdown, will cause more chaos in the country because people might die of hunger. So as at present, the National Assembly continues to function, and Tanzania borders with our neighbors are still open, with controls in place to restrict the movement of people and vehicle. And within Tanzania, people continue to congregate in markets, churches, and go to work, except from very few private companies which have opted for working at home alternatives for their employees. In fact, our president has faced criticism for urging citizens to gather in churches to pray for the defeat of the virus and for calling on Tanzanians to continue with all economic activities. Tanzania has declared it will not lock down any part of its economy owing to COVID-19. Instead, we are urged to take precautionary measures. Given the current pandemic, although there's no lockdown in Tanzania or any legislation passed in response to COVID-19, operation requirements for many companies, for example, in the leisure and hospitality and tourism industry have slowed down because of the globalization and interconnectedness of the business world. The measures taken by other governments across the world have resulted in minimal movement of people and goods affecting business operations in Tanzania. As such, many employers in Tanzania have looked at implementing measures that would ensure the sustainability of its business operation during these challenging times, but also seek to preserve the jobs of its workplace. I understand in other countries, example, in South Africa, a national state of disaster has been declared in terms of the Disaster Management Act, and several regulations and directives have been passed thereunder. In Kenya, there is a nationwide curfew, which was issued under the Public Order State of Curfew Order 2020, under the Public Order Act. And in Uganda, the primary piece of legislation is the Public Health Control COVID-19 rules of 2020. I understand as a matter of law, for instance, in South Africa, in circumstances as such with current health, where an employee is unable to tender his or her services, the no work, no pay principle can be applied. However, that arises in the current circumstance as a result of government regulation prohibiting people from working because of a lockdown or curfew or other legislation with regards to COVID-19. Unfortunately, there are currently no such regulations in Tanzania. Next, I will look at the various legal issues that have come about amid the outbreak of COVID-19 in the workplace as follows. One, forced leave. Tanzania employment law gives an employer the discretion of determining when annual leave is to be taken by its employee, provided that the employer ensure that the leave is taken 6 months after the end of the leave cycle or 12 months after the end of the leave cycle if the employee has consented and the extension is justified by the operational requirements of the employer. Given the current state of COVID-19, most companies' operational requirements may well dictate that employees should go on or be forced to take annual leave. Annual leave is 28 days and it is inclusive of the weekly rest days and public holidays falling in the leave period. So in terms of the Employment Act, annual leave must always be taken with a full pay. So if employers intend to force the employees to go on leave, they must make sure that employees are being full paid. Second, I will discuss on unpaid leave. Tanzania employment laws do not recognize unpaid leave initiated by the employer. In practice, unpaid leave is always initiated by the employees themselves. but is taken only with the approval of the employer. So in the current pandemic, it seems the only justification for the employer to initiate unpaid leave is that operational requirements make the employees redundant. Accordingly, this situation dictates that the employees be retrenched on grounds of redundance, in which case the legal requirement for redundancy will have to be complied with. Third, I will look at sick leave. And also in terms of the Employment Act, an employee who has been in employment for 6 consecutive months is entitled to sick leave. Employees are entitled to a total of 126 days of sick leave in a leave cycle of 36 months. The Employment Act requires that employer pays the employee who is genuinely ill full pay for a period up to 63 days, as if the employee had been at work during that time. And in the second phase, also of 63 days, the employer will be required to pay half a salary for each month of sickness. An employer shall not be required to pay an employee for sick leave if the employee fails to produce a medical certificate, or the employee is entitled to paid sick leave under any other law or collective agreement. Accordingly, employees who self-quarantine during the COVID-19 pandemic will be entitled to a full paid sick leave during the period only if they produce a medical certificate and have been employed in employment for 6 consecutive months. The next legal issues that have arisen in the workplace is the reduction of salaries. Under our law, an employer cannot unilaterally change the terms and conditions of an employee engagement where such a change is detrimental to the employee. If an employer wishes to implement salary reduction, it would need to obtain the employee's written consent. Where an employer unilaterally implements such changes, the employee may succeed in a claim for breach of fundamental term of employment contract. Therefore, even during these difficult times where an employer cannot afford to pay salaries or other contractual or statutory allowances as a result of operational requirements following the adverse effects of the pandemic, an employer must consult the employees or their trade union in order to get their consent to reduce their salary. In the next point, I will look at redundancy. And in this period, it is likely a number of employers will need to declare certain positions redundant. And our laws contain specific provisions on the procedure that must be followed when declaring position redundant. And the COVID-19 pandemic does not change this position. The associated tax implication of any payouts required to be made would also need to be considered. And last, I will look at temporary layoffs. Our labor law do not provide for temporary layoff of employees, but an employer who resorts to retrenchment of employees on operational requirement may include a term which permit the employer to reinstate or retrench the employees once operation permits. Thank you. I welcome any discussion on my presentation.
Thank you, Aisha, for such an interesting presentation. And you can already see the contrast with the difference in terms of approach taken by Tanzania and South Africa. But I think we have the opportunity to discuss this in the when it will come when we'll have to ask questions. And now I would like to give the floor to Chenesai, who will speak about the impact of COVID-19 on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and how it may has impacted, but she will use a kind of approach, a community-based approach to address this issue. So, Chenesai, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Aisha, for this very insightful position paper. I was listening in with a lot of enthusiasm because contrasted to the formal employment, I work in the informal sector. So part of the work we do at Chenesai Africa is working in the creative economy to work to design value chains that will work primarily to increase productivity, increase trade, to address some of the most important issues in our lifetime, such as poverty, as well as the empowerment of the girl child. So particularly by default, most of the creative participants in the sector are informal sector. And the informal sector, which constitutes almost 55% of sub-Saharan Africa, and in Zimbabwe, it's a startling 90% of our people are employed in the informal sector. Going into the position that Zimbabwe took back in March, once the communications were to institute a formal lockdown of the country, that particularly meant the movement of people were detained, the informal sector closed, majority companies closed, and what remained working at that point was the essential services. This position is akin to what was taken in South Africa. If we now look at the human-centered approach that we focus on, which focus on the humans, and working in a country that has 90% informal sector, which constitutes the majority of employment, and we have a situation where people are living hand to mouth, we found the lockdown measures instituted by Zimbabwe a bit arbitrary and almost tantamount, and I speak with utter carefulness, tantamount to human rights violations, because people could not work to find food, as well as sustain their families, and there was no immediate measures that were instituted to make provision that these same people will be able to feed their families and find work. So as we look at the promise of the African Continental Free Trade Area, the African Continental Free Trade Area basically is a great agreement that works to start changing the mindsets that we have in Africa, particularly towards an increased intra-African trade. If you look at intra-African trade or intercontinental trade, Africa poses the lowest number of intra-continental trade. So it is an opportunity, because at the point of negotiation, some of the clear objectives were, how do we increase trade? And how do we increase trade to increase the livelihoods of people? And how do we increase trade to increase our manufacturing sectors? And if you look at the trade of services offered under that agreement, it goes to the extent of offering or promising the offer of free movement of persons. So the three things I will touch on are COVID-19, the general measures that were taken by the country, Zimbabwe, particularly also Southern Africa. Number two, I will look at a community human-centered approach in resolving issues during a time of crisis. And number three, I will look at the promise of the African Free Continental Trade Area and how that synergizes or walks into the informal sector. As once stated by the IMF, it's very difficult to measure inclusive growth when we don't know how to measure the informal sector. And as you will pretty much know, the informal sector is a sector that operates outside the regulations of government. So most contractual laws and most laws of contracts that protect the individuals do not generally apply to the informal sector. So you do have a variation of sectors within the formal sector. You have sectors, businesses running from one-person-led businesses to businesses that can be 20-person-led businesses, the SMEs, the macro small enterprises. So what you now look at when you institute a measure to lock down a country without necessarily considering that the majority of people live hand to mouth, it leads us to start questioning the very issue of how will this informal sector resuscitate? Offering a stimulus package in a broken economy, but if we consider Zimbabwe as a case study, is going to be a stopgap measure that has a very low yield impact. The reason being is part of the informal sector was very reliant on the buying and selling of imported goods and services. the closing of borders, which is quite contrary to the provisions of the African Continental Free Trade Area and what it promises, already limits the movement of persons. And once you close the borders for a country like Zimbabwe, for instance, that most of the traders were doing the buying and selling from the different jurisdictions and spaces, that already limits and distorts the supply chain. Particularly as we have come to learn, the supply chain of most jurisdictions have been very much affected to the point of I think the average is about 33% effect on the supply chains. And this very supply chain is so fundamental to the informal trader because without access to basic goods and services that they would access in different spaces, they can't as much as trade to sustain their families. When we talk about family sustenance at the community-based level, it becomes very interesting to note that, as what so rightly pointed out by Aisha, we're talking about hand-to-mouth living. We're talking about people that beyond a day cannot sustain their families. So right now we are in Zimbabwe on lockdown stage 2. So what lockdown stage 2 means, it means the essential services and some businesses have opened, but the informal sector remains closed. And we're back to that very fact that 90% of our communities are living in the informal sector. They're employed in the informal sector. They're taking part in informal trade. What we do want to analyze as well as look at the Agenda 2063 for the continental market, which opens up a free trade agreement. What necessarily COVID-19 has done is, if we want to be very optimistic, is the closure of borders, not only in Africa, but across the world, could actually urge African leaders to facilitate that the agreement comes into full effect, so that internal manufacturing and trade of services can become a capacitating tool that will then lead to increased intra-African trade. If we look at the implication of COVID-19, is we can't import any more goods from China immediately. That already creates a void that can actually work to actually sustain our small micro enterprises towards increased trade of their services as well as increased manufacturing. So in a very ambitious way, what a lot of the measures that have been taken on the global scale to increase or to decrease the effect of COVID-19 was the offer of of the reduction of tax cuts, as well as the offer of stimulus packages. It would be very interesting to note in that in this paradigm that we exist, where 55% of sub-Saharan Africa operates in the informal sector, that reduction of tax won't apply because most people don't pay tax already. Their businesses are informal. Offering a stimulus package is going to be a very low impact measure. Why? Because the economies are already dead. For instance, in Zimbabwe, we are hand to mouth because our economy is not functioning. So that goes back to the ambition of trying to put into the works that how can we open up informal sector under the existing paradigm. If we look at the policy paper that was written by the UNDP, a policy position on the COVID-19, one of their recommendations, particularly on the informal sector, was there was a need, or there is still a need, for us to engage the informal sector where they meet at community level, understand what measures can be done to increase understanding and awareness of preventative measures so that we can start strategizing on how these markets can open. A vivid example that's given is, for instance, instead of saying, let's trade at a market, we allow informal traders to trade outside their houses. So that already reduces the crowding at the markets. So these are practical measures that we look at when we look at the promise of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is the biggest trade area in the history of the WTO, since the establishment of the WTO. it is premised on increasing trade. So at any given measure, when we come to issues of crisis and pandemic, like the COVID-19 has done to our community, our biggest opportunity is to consider how do we sustain this very informal market that is sustenance to the majority of the populations in Africa. So back to the issue of why then it is important to take a community-based approach in resolving the in matters of crisis. It was also, if we look at the case study of Eritrea, when they were addressing the issue of the crisis posed by COVID-19, they engaged strategically community leaders. Their number one goal was to ascertain, to try to say, how do we work with community leaders, spiritual leaders, community champions, to figure out ways to prevent the transmission of COVID-19. Immediately, that already gives us the view that the closure of markets is not an option, particularly when you're operating on a continent where the informal market is the leading market. So Eritrea, what they did, and what they did so well as a case study, is they worked with community leaders, and they talked about how do we contextualize these preventative measures in the communities that you serve. So for instance, some of the communique that was coming from the global space does not necessarily apply to the African context. So when we talk to people, for instance, about social distancing, it's very difficult to social distance when you live in a very small space with 7 people, 7 other families. So social distance becomes a novelty and something that cannot be applied. As such, we see there will still be an increase of the spread of the transmission because of the failure to approach the communities as a means to resolve the COVID-19. At the base of it, the only way we can eradicate some of these problems that are posed by some of these pandemics, which we still have quite a lot on our continent, such as malaria, that is still killing people, is we need to consider a community-based approach that centers the human development at heart. And particularly if we want to eradicate most of these problems, as already positioned in the African Continental Trade Agreement, we need to change our mindsets, understanding that trade is the only way we can sustainably empower our communities. So at the core of the decisions that we make under any crisis, particularly under the COVID-19 crisis, is how do we sustain trade, number one, and how do we sustain our informal trade parameters, and how do we take a human-centered approach towards an increased sustenance of trade of goods and services, as premised by this big agreement and a huge change of mindset in the African context. So I think for now, that's about what I wanted to share as background to the 3 spaces.
Okay, thank you, Chenesai, for such an interesting presentation. And I can see that Kate has joined us. So, hello, Kate.
Hi. Hi.
So, yes, we've started, and both Aisha and Chenesai have already spoken. And so now we'll give you the floor to share your thought on the impact of the economic impact of COVID-19 on human rights in Africa. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. So, and thank you to everyone for joining the webinar. So I'm going to speak about the impact of COVID-19 on responsible investing in Africa. Some of you may be aware that over the past couple of years, there's been a lot of attention being brought mainstream for investors to focus on responsible investing, sustainable investing. And responsible investing is essentially where investment takes into account more centrally themes around ESG, and also which incorporate the objectives of the Sustainable Development Goals. So with the COVID-19 crisis, we essentially have a health crisis, but also an economic crisis because it has affected the way people live, work, and also invest in economies. And what we have seen is that a lot of companies in Africa and around the world are essentially looking beyond making a profit and trying to make an impact in the economy and resolve some of the social issues relating to the crisis. And aside from these measures, we're also seeing funding coming from DFIs, private investors, and we're also seeing foundations and also governments trying to set up stimulus packages and relief packages to SMEs in economies. And in this process, we've seen that the funding is very targeted in that it tries to address health risks, safety, but also look into the welfare of communities and workplace. So in terms of looking at the COVID pandemic and situation, it's been said that we're basically going to deal with two situations where we have an emergency stage, a recovery stage, and also a resilience stage. And some countries, and quite frankly, many are still in the emergency stage. And to move into recovery and finally resilience, we see that ESG issues have become more important. We are seeing investment into the health sector. This normally happens, but this has become more increased and heightened to try and resolve issues around health and sanitation, provision of medical equipment, and also companies trying to provide relief for their employees to have medical access, but also to save jobs. And particularly on the issue of serving jobs, we now see a discussion where companies are a bit more cautious and careful and not rushing to just lay off workers. So companies are not operating on a basis of just focusing on generating a profit and the objectives of shareholders, but they're trying to balance the interests. We're seeing figures and articles and research out that shows that to try and delay a layoff or perhaps salary reductions, we're now seeing executive pay taking a cut, which wasn't the case previously. And this is a critical issue in the context of social and governance issues. So taking all this into account, we're also seeing research coming up that suggests that for funds that have been spreading their investments and allocating investment into assets that are more focused on responsible investment, we're seeing that these funds seem to be a bit more resilient and are able to better endure the risk of the pandemic than funds that are just profit-oriented. And in this particular session, and from my observations, and I would encourage comments from everyone, I think what we will see is that ESG and responsible investing will become more important. We will see a prioritization of human rights in the business context. So it will not just be an issue of business as usual. And this is sad, but in some ways it's also a positive in that it's going to help us create a new way of doing business. We have seen some of the companies around the world essentially change the products they're making. So we did see LVMH stop making perfumes or reduce the commitment of their equipment to producing perfumes and try and produce sanitizers. We've seen Alibaba try and give some relief to SMEs. We've also seen Novartis put forward a commitment for an anti-malaria drug so that this can be explored to find a COVID cure. And all of these measures are essentially a different kind of way of doing business. And this presents a case for governments, policy think tanks, universities, and all of us to rise up to the occasion and essentially ask that, after we are through with the emergency stage of COVID, there are better ways that we can respond to social issues in our community. We've got issues around water and sanitation and informal settlements that have now come to the center because social distancing is not possible in such communities. And it gives us a chance to look into those issues and for money to flow to those sectors. And so in this process, I think what has become important is that now more than ever, it's time for the world to focus on responsible investing to help us address issues of climate change, water and sanitation, health, and also the labor market and decency of work levels in Africa. And it also gives a chance for us to give more attention to social enterprises. There are a couple of social enterprises in Africa that have been doing very commendable work, going into sectors that are not traditionally seen as prized sectors. And in that process, they're generating a profit, but they're also serving a social good in their communities. And this is a chance to give more attention to those kind of entities and for policy makers to try and support this type of business and initiative. If it's providing tax relief, we've seen governments do that for businesses that have been doing well to help them go through this process. This is something that can be done to support the SME community and also social. And I'll end there and just allow for questions.
Okay, thank you, Kate, for this. Very interesting, the issue of responsible investing in this current situation. So now I think I will give the opportunity to the audience to ask some questions, make some comments after the, I can see that Osita David raised his hand. So maybe David, you can ask your question. Maybe unmute your microphone and ask your question, David.
So I'm having some challenges. Maybe, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Good morning, everyone.
Oh.
Obviously, I just want to my question has to go to Aisha.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to do with issue of labor matters. Obviously, our present labor laws never anticipated COVID-19, but it had just come to stay. I'm calling from Nigeria, and as a labor leader, we have come to see a lot of things that are totally out of the control of the labor unions, such as the issue of salary reduction, the issue of threat of no work, no pay. A lot of things are just going on here without the proper procedure, as you have initiated in the introduction. And I feel that, for instance, in the banking sector here in Nigeria, we found out that a lot of underground moves have been made by the banks to lay down their workers without even engaging the relevant labor authorities and the labor leaders. And my concern is this: is there anyhow we can engage all these companies in order not to, allow them to carry on with their planned retrenchment. As a matter of fact, there's a real plan for massive retrenchment of workers in Nigeria. Why I'm saying this is that he that goes to APT must come with clean hands. We find out that most of these bankers, we are the people who were called by the government of Nigeria to make donations to the government to fight in respect of this COVID-19, battle. And now these people are relying on the fact that they gave government money. Therefore, they are at liberty to do what? To do whatever they want to do in order to keep their companies afloat. And one of them is the issue of no work, no pay, redundancy, and salary reduction. What do you think could be done in order to stem this? That is my concern.
Okay, thank you, David. And Aisha, if you want to respond to this question. Aisha, are you with?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, David, for your question. Well, I think what the important thing to be done is for the labor leader to engage with the banks and discuss on this issue in order to get a win-win situation for both sides. For instance, in Tanzania, our laws do not allow termination of employment on operation requirements. Actually, our law demands that there must be evidence of a genuine need for such operational requirements. So the employer is obliged to ensure that before carrying out retrenchment, all possible alternatives have been considered in order to minimize or avoid termination of employees on such ground. So I think it's important for the labor leaders and the banks to make sure that they are going through all the alternatives available to make sure that these employees remain in their position, because otherwise most employers will take advantage of the situation and lay off workers. And it's very important to follow the procedure under your laws for termination for operational requirements or retrenchment. Because here in Tanzania, if you don't follow the procedures as laid out under the law, then the retrenchment would not stand. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Aisha. I can see that also Kevin wants to ask a question. So, Kevin, maybe...
Yes, thank you very much, Coordinator. My name is Kevin. I'm calling from Uganda.
Okay.
And my question goes to Madame Chenesai, who was talking about the African Continental Free Trade Area, and that we may use COVID-19 as an opportunity to better intra-Africa trade. But taking an example from the East African community, we have each country running its own emergency response tactics. We have borders are closing, truck drivers are being refused from entering here and there. In my view, this COVID-19 has actually divided us more and may lead to lesser trade amongst ourselves. I don't know what you think about that view, but I think the COVID-19, if I'm assessing it, has actually made us digress from the main aim of coming together and deciding things together and attacking any common issue at the, with the same approach. I don't know what, Madam, you say to that.
Thank you so much for the very relevant and important question, which is really an observation, and in my sense, a very accurate observation, because that actually forms the basis of the analysis. So initially, when you think about how we have handled COVID-19, we have failed to contextualize COVID-19 into our systems. And why I say that is all the measures that were taken, for instance, by America, almost seems to be the ones that came and were applied in our settings without much contextualization. Therein lies the opportunity. And I'm not sure if the UNDP has done a policy paper on the COVID-19 in your country, but they've done one for Zimbabwe. And one of the biggest recommendations is to go back to a community human-centered approach, where we now think, okay, this is our situation, right? We need to actually allow trade to happen. We cannot afford to close borders. So all the assertions that you have advanced are the very things that we need to sit back, where our leaders need to sit back and analyze the very reason why they even started the negotiating of the African Continental Free Trade Area. I quote, one of the very things that were one of the aims of the African Continental Free Trade Area was to create a single continental market for goods and services with free movement of business persons and investments, and thus pave the way for accelerating the establishment of the Continental Customs Union and the African Customs Union. So basically what I'm asserting is a build up from your very pointed observations. How do we go back to the drawing board and actually realize that we need to go back and understand in Africa, we need the increased movement of people. We need these borders to be opened. But how do we now engage our communities at the borders, the truck drivers, the informal traders, to solution ways around COVID-19? We need an African solution for this problem. So far, I haven't seen any.
Okay, it's an interesting discussion, and I think we'll also continue with some other questions. At the end, all the speakers, you will have 1-2 minutes for your final remarks. So maybe keep it in mind. I can see a question on our chat box from iPhone saying, we have seen an unprecedented increase in the amount of IMF loans to African countries. What's your view on the long-term impact to our economies, given Tanzania's approach on not locking down the economy and the rest of the government, like Zimbabwe, who have adopted measures that actually worsen the already compressed economies? I don't know if maybe Kate want to share views on this question. What do you think can be the long-term impact? And also, yes, given the increased amount of loans given by the IMF to African countries, if maybe you want to speak a bit about this.
Thank you, Jonathan. So in terms of the increased amount of loans being given to countries, I think this comes down to an issue of negotiation of the terms that the countries are agreeing to. Obviously, in terms of bargaining power, the IMF has more bargaining power than the countries, but it's also quite clear in a number of countries that they'll need more access, governments will need more access to capital. I don't work in government myself, but it is hoped that the teams that get to negotiate these loans can negotiate terms that are feasible for their stage of development and their projected income. So some countries already have a lot of loans with China and a couple of other development banks. So I think this would involve a review of a country's existing obligations, and hopefully that at the point that a country is negotiating a loan with the IMF, they've tried to develop a risk matrix and relax, say, ask for an extension on interest payments or extend the term of the loan. I've seen this happening for businesses trying to approach their banks, and banks being a bit more reasonable in Zambia and saying, we'll give a payment holiday on interest, or we extend the tenure of the loan by 2 or 3 years. So that would be my position on that. In terms of not locking down the economy, like Tanzania, we're in a very similar situation. We're a landlocked country, and the reasoning, or part of the reasoning of our government has been that effectively we would be landlocked if all of the other countries surrounding us lock down the economies. I would like to say it's a double-edged sword. I think the immediate reaction is to lock down economies, curb the spread of the pandemic and restrict movement. But being an African myself, I think it can also be perceived as a luxury for countries whose economic systems are developed up to a certain stage. So if you do a lot of manufacturing, production of agriculture, and you have a developed formal sector, and also you have, say, unemployment insurance for the unemployed or some sort of social fund, you're in a better position to make certain decisions. So I have seen that certain countries are grappling with whether do we lock down the economy completely and fail to bring in perhaps food or other stock or stock in trade for businesses to continue? Do we ask people to stay home? What happens to the people whose daily income is to go to the streets, make money, and then go back home? So I think there are a lot of governments working on that basis of trying to save the economy while also trying to save the people. I haven't yet seen a perfect balance, but I think it's a work in progress. And perhaps what an interesting approach is the one in South Africa, where you're seeing restrictions being relaxed. There are also excuses and reasons that in certain countries, there are very few cases of COVID, and few is very subjective. We don't know if this is based on robust testing or this is because of limited testing kits. But in terms of long-term impact, I think it has to be a case of balancing what measures can be put in place to save an economy and also focusing on the safety of people. So in terms of the loans, it's negotiating terms that are reasonable and extending the tenure of these loans in a manner that can allow your economy to recover at a reasonable stage. And in terms of the measures, it's also perhaps not locking down the entire country, but locking down the cities that appear to be epicenters and trying to ease down on the restrictions as time goes by.
Thank you. Yes, it's a difficult, question. And as you said, you don't have a clear answer. It's like different approaches on this issue. We also give the opportunity to Zenzo Zaza to ask his question, and also after Linda will ask a question. So Zenzo Zaza, if you want to speak now. Maybe unmute your microphone so we can hear you.
Hi.
Hi.
Oh, can you get me?
Yes, now.
Okay. For me, it's just a contribution on what the other participant from Uganda, where he was talking about COVID-19 has divided Africa more than ever. For me, for us to have a properly fledged African continental free trade area, we need to have certain basics. And those basics are each country should create certain capacities in terms of infrastructure, for health, roads, and other things. That is the reason why each country at the moment is looking at dealing with the COVID-19 in a more personalized way than it wasn't supposed to have been. we cannot compare ourselves to America in the sense that each state in America has its own.
The power thing on my laptop, but I'll use my phone. Okay, sure.
Who is speaking? Zenzo?
Yes.
Mhm.
So yes, I'm saying when you look at the situation in America, each state has its own infrastructure in terms of health, and it's dealing with those things at that level. So even us as Africans now, we should create structures, proper health structures to combat certain diseases. Then at the end of the day, we should combine all the efforts of what is already created in all other African countries to come up with a strong free trade area. And that's the only way we can manage to fight these pandemics. We need to create our own individual structures. Then with regards the loans, what I've just seen, the IMF loans, this is just going to encourage responsible borrowing by individual countries. So again, it boils down to each country should be responsible. Do you need the loan? And if you need the loan, how do you negotiate it?
Hi, Lloyd. Apologies to everyone. Hello, apologies to everyone.
Yeah. Kate, do you want to speak? Maybe. Hello. Kate, seems. Okay. I mean, yes, for Zenzo, it was more a contribution. But Kate, do you want to speak? Because your microphone is open now.
Hello, sorry. If you could just repeat the question.
No, it was more about a contribution, I think. Because for Zenzo, it's more about a responsible approach for each country if we really need those loans. And I think, yes, maybe in your final remarks, you also probably give your thought on maybe what he said, if you want to, yes, I mean, speak about it. But I think I will give the floor now to Linda, who had the question.
Yeah, I think it's a question, but also probably a reflection for everyone, and is not necessarily directed to one of the speakers, but to like anyone, probably even if we have people working for the government here. I think the points Zenzo raised are important, and it's something that we should ponder on, like, what are these loans for? Why do we need them? And also channeling of those loans are important. What are we using the money for? You know, because our problem is not like, you know, every other country. I live in Germany, you know, here they're worried about COVID-19. But in Africa, we're more worried about poverty, hunger, and in addition to COVID-19. So if money was our problem, or if money was a way to solve the problem that we're going through in Africa, then, you know, US, for instance, would have had all the ventilators they needed. They're a very rich country, but still they don't have enough ventilators to cater to people. So I don't know if there's anyone who's working for the government here and who is involved in getting those loans. I'm wondering, like, where are these loans going to? What's the money for? How are they channeling it? And how can it help? So maybe this will be a question to the speakers. How can it help solve our situation right now? Because what we want to do is find a way to save the economy, but also save lives.
Okay, that's an interesting one. And I think our three speakers are not working from the government from what they say, but I think they can also share their view on this question, on the need maybe for an African-based approach to this virus, and I think after it will probably close
so Jonathan, just to make a quick comment on Zaza's comments, I definitely agree that, you know, in relation to these loans, there needs to be purpose and responsibility. What are they for? Obviously, the question was a bit more generic, but you know, the assumption is that if these loans are on the table, there's a discussion, either that's COVID related or perhaps it's to support economies. But I definitely agree and understand those concerns.
Okay. So maybe yes, I can see Memory Dube, if you want to maybe unmute your microphone and please ask your question.
Hi, everyone. Well, I don't work for a government, but I work for the African Development Bank, and we are also a lender. We recently created a $10 billion US dollar facility for COVID-related assistance. And what I can tell you is that we are funding operations that will specifically address the immediate health, economic, and social consequences of the pandemic on our regional member countries, that being African countries, as well as their ability to sustain similar shocks in the future. So most of the lending that will come from this $10 billion facility will be to address challenges that are immediately, or other challenges that are connected to the COVID pandemic. So it's not just, you know, random loans to address long-standing challenges, but challenges that have been created by the pandemic, but also looking to make sure that post the pandemic, countries are actually able to rebound. Thank you.
Thank you for this view from as someone who is working for the African Development Bank, so it's a more practical view on this issue. And I think I will now give the floor to our speakers for their concluding remarks. For Chenesai, yes, I will give you the floor, but I have a kind of small question. The thing, based on what Aisha said and also what is reported on the news, that the Tanzanian response is what we need as a community-based approach for the response here in Africa. And also after you can conclude on, yes, with your final remarks.
Thank you very much. I think it's been very interesting. Thank you to my colleagues for their views and very important contributions, and to the audience at large for asking some very interrogating questions and also just listening in. I think importantly, when you look at law, we say intention is very important in any action. And if the Tanzania approach's intention was to protect its people, then it becomes a very sustainable look and see approach. So in the absence of a clear intention as to why certain measures are being taken, we rest back on the idea or ideal of the lack of systems and processes that can sustain our decisions in order to better our communities in the case of a crisis. Crisis management or crisis risk communication and pandemics are not new to the continent, neither are they new to the world. I mean, we recently in North Africa, with the advent of Ebola, perhaps maybe with Eritrea, their advantage was actually having experienced the Ebola pandemic and understanding that when you get a pandemic that hits your country, what solves the problem is not government, it is actually the community. So finding ways and structuring systems and processes that already automatically link directly to the people to allow people to solution in an effective way would actually help us eradicate some of the issues. An advantage that we had in Africa is we actually generally, whether we look at scale or we look with skepticism, have a low case of COVID-19 cases. In fact, in Zimbabwe, we probably have a higher case of malaria patients over COVID-19 and all the other issues that we have in our societies. But what that tells us is the opportunity there was to say, okay, how do we contextualize the problem for Africa? And how do we link to the communities immediately and find a solution? I will say this with complete circumspection. When you look at the approach in America, that was also another opportunity. It hit America and the community went wild. It destroyed New York City because part of the opportunity was immediately to engage the community and see how do we solution so that the COVID-19 does not spread. Passing regulations and policy and having meetings at high level in the case of a crisis does not resolve the issues. Now, in my concluding remarks on the African Continental Free Trade Area, the long-term effects of COVID-19 are very difficult to ascertain at this point, given its novelty globally. However, short-term, it does present an opportunity for us as Africans to figure out how do we come back to the table and use this very platform to resuscitate and build capacity of our small sector, medium enterprises in order to increase the trade of services, which immediately trade of services do not need borders to be open. It needs a mindset to understand that services can still be traded. And also the trade of goods. We need now to restructure and realize we already have an agreement that is annexures, that are protocols. How do we now effectively come together immediately and start enacting some of these issues into our local laws as is needed in any of these continental agreements? What would be a loss, right, is for African countries and the African leaders at the AU not to relook at the agreement right now in context of what COVID has done. Immediately, we can realize, as we have realized in this conversation, mistakes were made. We closed the borders. We failed to protect our informal traders. Some would actually assert that this was a violation of human rights. It would be actually an interesting line to actually contemplate, because a lot of families are not going to die from COVID now, they're going to die from hunger, which is a whole new issue. So immediately, what we do need is a reinvention of our leaders, looking at this agreement and what it positions to do, looking at the position of our communities. Our communities, 55% sub-Saharan Africa is informal. How do we continue trade in the informal sector to protect lives so that people don't die of hunger? And importantly, Zenzo also raised a very important point. Infrastructure development is very important. And I do understand the head of the African Development Bank, one of their pledges to the African Continental Trade Agreement was to increase in infrastructure development in Africa in order to increase trade facilitation. So all these things will come into play, but practically the first step, the very first step is how do we regroup and engage communities to solve this problem so that our informal markets can continue operating, so that we can save lives, not only from COVID, but also from hunger, as well as other pandemics that are hitting Africa, such as malaria. So thank you so much. Those are my closing remarks.
Thank you for this conclusion, and we'll see in the coming month whether or not if they will be able to start this agreement on July 2020. If this is the case, probably some of the issues will be addressed, and we'll see what will be the next step. So now I'm turning to Aisha.
Okay, thank you very much. In conclusion, it is my opinion that at this time when events develop quickly, with a high level of uncertainty and anxiety among workers and the population at large, the participation of workers and their representatives in relation to measures to be implemented by the employer to ensure the sustainability of business operations during these challenging times is very important and is a key success and a legal obligation. Therefore, it is important that employers consult their workers or their representatives early on about plan changes and how temporary processes will work in practice. For instance, in Tanzania, we are urged to take precautionary measures and engaging workers in assessing risks and developing responses, I think it is an important part of good health and safety practice. Health and safety representatives are in a unique position to help design preventive measures and to ensure that they are implemented successfully. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this conclusion. And now, Kate, you want to conclude? Is she with us? Kate, are you here?
Yes, I can hear you. So I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's joined and to my fellow panelists. It's been a very interesting session. My close remarks are really that I think this is a great opportunity for us to contribute to the development of the new normal. I like what Chenesai has said, that, you know, laws in themselves will not resolve issues. It's up to us to be aware, to see what's working and what's not, and try and influence change. Obviously, it's a crisis and the government is more proactive, but we can also see that there's situations we can pick from here to incorporate into future development. I'm a strong advocate of responsible investing and impact investing, and I think this is where the future for Africa lies. We've got a lot of social problems that need to be resolved. I'd really like to see the African Continental Free Trade Area become a reality and see more Africans trade together. And I think if we were in a place where the African Continental Trade Area was in full force and more active, we would definitely see countries be more cooperative and be more concerned about maintaining trade between countries. That's all. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And I would like to thank all of you for your presence at this third discussion, and also take this opportunity to say that next Thursday we'll have the fourth one. So if you can, I think this will be also a great opportunity to discuss, interact. And this Tuesday we'll have also another webinar focused on the impact of this COVID-19 on business and human rights. So some of these questions will also be addressed there. And so those who can, I think you can be invited to also participate. So thank to everyone for the participation and have a nice day. So, bye.
Thank you, you too. Bye.